Hongkong's Chief Executive Carrie attempts to create a dialogue with protesters. Will it be enough? Welcome to a special edition of The Point, an opinion show coming to you live from Beijing. I'm Zhong Shi, in for Liu Xing today. After another turbulent weekend for Hong Kong, is a path to a resolution beginning to emerge? Chief Executive Carrie announced at a press conference on Tuesday that she met with individuals over the past several days, the aim being to establish a program for an open and constructive dialogue. However, Lam stood firm, saying she would not accept the demands of the protesters. Given this impasse, will the talks produce any constructive results? Joining me today from Hong Kong, Lawrence Ma, barrister and chairman of the Hong Kong Legal Exchange Foundation. And here in Beijing, Victor Gao, vice president of the Center for China and Globalization, and Qinduo, senior fellow at the Pangoal Institution. Gentlemen, welcome to The Point today. Mr. Ma, let me start with you. Carrie seems to believe that a dialogue platform could be a possible way out of the current impasse, the current prolonged crisis in Hong Kong. But now one of the key questions is who will be invited to the dialogue, and will they be representative enough of the people that have been taken to the streets to express their demands and their opinions? Your take?
Well, she has invited, as far as we are aware, at least about 40 to 50 community leaders, former legislative councillors, university chancellors, as well as people from the media, representatives from the media, together in a, I would say, confidential meeting in the government house. Of course, the conversation was confidential, and people fit in what they know to her. And all the secretaries for justice, secretary for all the secretaries, senior ministers are all there. One of the messages, or at least we can see in the news, is from Mr. Lam Tai-fai, who is also a member of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, who was openly critical of the government. He said that he would want to see the Secretary for Justice to step down and replaced, and the entire cabinet, particularly the executive councillors of the cabinet, to be replaced. And it seems that's the only information we can get out from that closed-door conference. Yes.
All right, before we move on, I want to have you look at this post by Carrie Lam. On Sunday, she posted on Facebook expressing her concerns. Let's take a look at what she said, and I quote, "Many netizens criticized the government's past so-called dialogue that was not comprehensive enough and questioned the dialogue and the delay in the conversation. We hope that the platform that is built is for the residents of Hong Kong, and the forum must break through the limitations of the past, and I and other colleagues must conduct a direct, deep, and continuous interactive dialogue with the public." Mr. Xu, here in Beijing, how can Carrie Lam and the SAR government deliver a dialogue that is different from those she's had in the past, and how will it work with the protesters?
Well, what is good is we are seeing the dialogue ongoing between the government and the representatives from the communities and from the youth, some of the youth leaders over the past couple of days. Remember, previously, there's a proposal from the government to have dialogue with the university unions, but which was rejected by the university union. So dialogue is good. Let's agree upon that. And secondly, I think it's really up to the protesters, in particular those radical elements, whether they agree to put down, I would say, those their bricks, metal poles, etc., and resort to a peaceful consultation and dialogue to solve the problems. Whatever grievances they have, whatever demands they have to solve that or achieve that through peaceful means, and the violence in the first place should be given up. Otherwise, I think the dialogue will also meet some difficulties in the days ahead.
Mr. Gao, what do you think of the willingness of the protesters. Will they be willing to participate in this new round of dialogue? Because the reaction to that post we just talked about, if that's any indication, it's not very optimistic. Over 45,000 people reacted to that post, but they were overwhelmingly negative. Just over 6,000 people liked the post. The vast majority of them disliked it with an angry face. What is happening here? Will they be listening?
Well, the situation in Hong Kong is at a very sensitive and delicate point. Something needs to be done to restore law and order, and also to restore people of Hong Kong's confidence in the Hong Kong SAR government, and to really charter a better course forward for the Hong Kong SAR. Now, what Carrie Lam said today, and the dialogue she held over the past days or weeks, is at least a very good positive step forward. Whether that is sufficient to solve the impasse right now, it remains to be seen, but at least it's a good beginning. Now, of top priority in Hong Kong is to restore law and order. Without restoration of law and order, any dialogue will be meaningless, and eventually I'm very doubtful as to whether the dialogue can take place in the first place, and whether the dialogue, once started, can really move towards a constructive and meaningful outcome for the people in Hong Kong to accept, for the Hong Kong SAR government to accept. And don't forget, whatever that's happening in Hong Kong is not just purely between the Hong Kong SAR government and the residents of Hong Kong. Hong Kong itself has a strong bearing on the one country, two system principle, and the mainland's central government, as well as the 1.4 billion Chinese people on the mainland, have a big say in what's happening in Hong Kong too. So we really need to do a lot of navigation, if I may use that word, to break the impasse and to charter a good, constructive, stable path forward for the people in Hong Kong.
Mr. Ma, I want to come back to the dialogue itself. With the limited information available now, do we know what topics will be covered in the dialogue?
It is actually an open-ended dialogue, and there is simply, of course, people will focus on what's the current situation in Hong Kong and how to deal with it, and how to survive the balance of her terms, and that's the focus, without even you setting any agendas to the dialogue. But with respect to the dialogue between her and the protesters, and that is a million-dollar question. You simply do not know what these protesters really want. I mean, of course, they have the 5 requests. And of course, they've removed demanding Carrie Lam to resign and replace it with election promises. But I mean, do we know these would be the real questions, and whether they would be sincerely dealing with the protesters? Would they do they really have genuinely believe that this is the questions that to be answered? And if they are answered, and what is the satisfactory answer from her? These are all unknowns.
Mr. Xu, will those previous 5 demands all be presented in the dialogue? Because for any dialogue to really produce any breakthrough, concessions must be made, and oftentimes on both sides. What will that process be like, in your opinion?
Well, you know, like for any protest or demonstration, you know, peaceful, usually you want to express some of your grievances or demands, and you want to have your voice heard. In the case of Hong Kong, obviously, there's enough time, enough space for the government and for the whole society to listen to the voice of the protesters, including those 5 demands. And one of them, for example, the withdrawal of the extradition bill, which started this round of crisis, has already been shelved. So this is a bit, I would say, aggressive on the protesters' side. You know, they are continuing to ask for official, basically, withdrawal of the bill. Carrie Lam has said it is dead, and that's a period. And also, you know, one of the demands is really about amnesty of those rioters being charged, being detained by the police and by the court. And I think Hong Kong, as a place, you know, run with rule of law as the cornerstone, everybody should respect the law. If there's a violation of the law, either by the protesters or by the police force or by any government officials, that should be charged, that should be detained. Let's follow the law. And if you're asking for amnesty while breaking the law, there's a problem. Whatever demands, however lofty they might be, if you want to achieve your means by breaking the law, the end will be unjustified, I would say.
And in a press conference, Carrie Lam made sure that her agreeing to the dialogue would not be regarded as a sign of weakness. She said she is open to dialogue with protesters, but that the government will not tolerate violence. Take a listen.
Starting a dialogue doesn't mean that we will condone violence. If violence continues, the only thing that we should do is to stem out that violence through law enforcement actions.
Mr. Ma, picking up on that, what kind of law enforcement actions is referring to here? If she means the police actions, haven't the police forces in Hong Kong been doing just that?
Exactly. Now, in Hong Kong, since 1922, there is this emergency regulation ordinance, which means that the chief executive in council can, by executive order, because of the public safety is in jeopardy, to order or implement an emergency regulation. The regulation has a wide power to, for example, press censorship, for example, deportation of criminals. For example, you do search at homes and detain people. Now, these are very wide power and exercisable during emergency. Now, I think what she's referring to new laws is this emergency regulation ordinance, which are tailor-made for emergency situation like Hong Kong now happening.
Mr. Gao, I want to continue with something you said. You mentioned how the central government and all Chinese people have been keeping tabs on the situation in Hong Kong. And now at a seminar over the weekend to commemorate the 115th anniversary of the birthday of late Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping, who practically brought up the idea, the concept of one country, two systems, senior officials said that the central government might step in if necessary. Now, this prolonged crisis, this prolonged unrest in Hong Kong is now 3 months old. Mr. Gao, does the length of the crisis matter to the central government? Will it make a difference in terms of the central government weighing its options on what it might do?
Well, first of all, if we read the provisions of the Basic Law, then it's very clear to all of us and to all the people in Hong Kong, as well as to all the governments and people throughout the world, that strictly according to the Basic Law, the central government, under certain circumstances, can step in a political situation in Hong Kong with the aim of bringing back law and order and defend the territory against aggression, for example, maintaining sovereignty of China, etc. So no one should doubt the legality of the central government's actions if they are taken according to the Basic Law in helping the Hong Kong SAR government to restore law and order in Hong Kong. And that is not by violating one country, two systems. That's strictly by abiding by the one country, two systems. So no one in Hong Kong or elsewhere should indulge in the fantasy that the central government of China should just sit tight and idle around and just witness the deterioration of the situation in Hong Kong. No. If the situation in Hong Kong deteriorates and gets more and more out of control, there is one option, and most likely to happen, that the central government will need to step in. And it is either at the request of the Hong Kong SAR government or to be made in the sole discretion of the National People's Congress's Standing Committee, that the situation is dire enough in Hong Kong for the central government to step in. Now, for the moment, we do not need to talk about that right now. Why? Because the central government of China has expressed the full support for Carrie Lam, for her government, for the Hong Kong police force, and it is now fully expected that Carrie Lam, as the chief executive, and the Hong Kong SAR government and the Hong Kong police will have enough support from the central government, will have enough resources to do their job, that is restore law and order in Hong Kong. I think that's the top priority, because without restoration of law and order, there will be no meaningful dialogue to talk about at all. No one should indulge in the fantasy that you can have destruction of law and order in Hong Kong and then you have meaningful dialogue. No, that's impossible, I would say.
And the SAR government has emphasized time and again that it is in control of the situation. Mr. Xu, I want to hear your take on the role of the PLA garrison also, because some analysts have pointed out that the protesters have been deliberately provoking the central government to act. They want to see whether there will be intervention from Beijing. Your take on the situation?
Well, I agree. I think obviously if you look at some of the acts by the violent protesters, for example, trampling on the national flag and the defacement of the national emblem in the representative office in Hong Kong of the central government. You know they are trying to provoke the central government to do something in response. But remember, there are laws, there are regulations, and I think any action from the Hong Kong government or from the central government will follow those existing laws and orders and regulations. For example, if there's an intervention by the People's Liberation Army or the armed police, especially the People's Liberation Army, probably on the two occasions. One is like on the request by the Hong Kong government and also approved by the central government. And the two circumstances, for example, if there's a disaster, if there's I would say emergency situation that endangers Hong Kong's safety, Hong Kong's future, and Hong Kong's the public interest, at that time, I think the central government is obliged to step in. And also, as Mr. Gao pointed out, if the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress, the highest power echelon in China, I would say, if they reach understanding that there's something we need to do, we have to intervene for the future of Hong Kong, yes, this is also the occasion the central government will be obliged to intervene.
Mr. Ma, reflecting on the Occupy Central movement and the ongoing protests in Hong Kong, what do you think is the biggest difference here? Is the China-US trade war or other external factors shaping the movement, shaping where the situation goes next?
Well, I think it seems the trade war is not ending, and embargo has just been, or taxes has just been levied by China on the US goods. And the United States has retaliated very quickly. And I don't think the trade war is going to end. As long as the trade war and as long as the Hong Kong situation is tied to the trade war, the Hong Kong protests would not end. I think the fundings would keep coming from foreign governments to fund the Hong Kong protests until they get what they want, I think. So in order to, I mean, if you want the Hong Kong protests to come to an end, I would have thought that the trade war has to come to a conclusion. And we don't know when will that be.
The United States has said that China and the U.S. will resume trade talks. Mr. Gao, is it somehow linked with the situation in Hong Kong, and will the Hong Kong situation be used as a bargaining chip in ensuing trade talks between Beijing and Washington?
You know, China is a country, and the Chinese government is a government of principles. And no one in China, no Chinese leader, no Chinese political force in China would ever talk about and tolerate about foreign intervention in the internal affairs of Hong Kong. Whatever that's happening in Hong Kong is purely Chinese domestic matters within the four corners of the Chinese sovereignty. So anyone in any country, for example, anywhere in the world, who indulge in fantasy that whatever they may support, for example, certain political forces in Hong Kong may actually enhance their negotiating position vis-à-vis the Chinese government in the trade war discussions or otherwise, is purely indulging in fantasy. No one should have that kind of daydream, and no one should expect that their daydreams will become a success. That's one thing. Now, secondly, I think purely on the trade war situation, China has enough wherewithals to stand firm and hold ground. We do not want to have a trade war with the United States. Whatever that is happening in the trade war between China and the United States is all initiated by President Trump and the U.S. government. Whatever China is doing is retaliating in a measured way, in a proportional way, rather than, for example, we seize the moment and we up the ante in the trade war with the United States. Our best hope is that the trade war will be over as quickly as possible, and the Chinese business communities, American business communities can go back to their normal job, doing a good job. And the Chinese people will be beneficiary, the American people will be beneficiary. So I really do not want to see any link between the trade war discussion between China and the United States and whatever that is happening in the situation involving Hong Kong. Anyone building such artificial connection will fail in their own way.
Mr. Xu, the name of one American organization has come up again and again in the current protests, and that's the National Endowment for Democracy. It has been active in Hong Kong, but is there sufficient evidence to link the NED to what has been happening in Hong Kong?
Well, NED is a National Democracy Endowment for Democracy. Was created in the 1980s. Actually, it was an extension of the function of Central Intelligence Agency, or CIA. At that time, the Reagan administration basically said that to avoid the protest from the public and the Congress, we need a different organization. The best would be, say, non-government organization or NGO. So you can conduct the business in a secret way. The business used to be conducted by CIA. For example, like to sabotage and say overthrow the government, which the United States does not like. That includes the color revolution, afterwards, and of course many political events around the world. And in 1991, a former chairman of NED basically made it public, like he admitted that the work of NED is really the work used to be done by CIA. And in 2014, remember, there's Occupy Central in Hong Kong, which endures like 70 days, more than 70 days that time. U.S. scholar, political advisor of the Trump administration, Pillsbury, said basically at that time that he made, in the short video, he said that there were millions of U.S. dollars donated from NED to organizations in Hong Kong to support the Occupy Central. This time around, actually, from the documents by NED, which is available online, you can see at least a few organizations in Hong Kong received the money from NED. You can see, of course, under the name of supporting democracy, yes, there are political intervention from the United States. NED basically is a department, a part of the U.S. government, remember, despite the name called non-government organization, because it received its funding primarily from the Congress.
Gentlemen, I want to have all of you look at a close neighbor to Hong Kong. That's the southern Chinese metropolis of Shenzhen. It's interesting, as this crisis continues in Hong Kong, a lot of attention has been placed on its neighbor, Shenzhen. People like to draw comparisons between the two cities, and not just because they're located geographically close together. It's also because there are concerns, especially from people in Hong Kong, that Shenzhen might one day surpass Hong Kong and replace Hong Kong in terms of economic vitality and global competitiveness. Mr. Ma, what is your understanding on the role of Shenzhen and its synergy with Hong Kong in the region?
Well, I think measuring by GDP, Shenzhen has already surpassed Hong Kong since last year, I think. But of course, we have a different administration system. We have an independent judiciary. We have the Western style of the rule of law, and we have English-speaking ability for many of the professions in Hong Kong, professionals in Hong Kong. Now, we still think that we have a niche when representing China with the external or other international countries or other countries internationally. So, I mean, if you want to say that Shenzhen is actually replacing Hong Kong in totality, I would disagree. But Shenzhen has already catch up in its GDP, and Hong Kong is, of course, particularly because of these riots and unlawful assembly, its economy is going down. Yes.
Gross domestic product, of course, is just one barometer. Mr. Gao, what are they? Are they competitors? Are they partners?
Well, in the best case scenario, Shenzhen and Hong Kong each have its own role to play, and each has its own unique advantages. Hong Kong is truly a unique place, and in the normal situation, Hong Kong really is very important for the Chinese economic development, as it has always been for the past 40 years or so, and I hope it will continue to play a very useful, important role up to 2049 and 47 and way beyond. However, whatever comparative advantages Hong Kong has are important but not totally indispensable. I hope people in Hong Kong should bear that in mind. And if the situation is lost in Hong Kong, if law and order cannot be restored, if confidence in Hong Kong is destroyed, for example, there will be massive capital flight out of Hong Kong, massive flight of talents, and regional headquarters of multinationals will need to be relocated somewhere else, and the strength of Hong Kong will be decimated. And without really eagerly and intentionally seek to replace Hong Kong, Shenzhen will replace Hong Kong, as a matter of fact. So I would say the only way to make sure that Hong Kong will not lose out, comparing with Shenzhen or Shanghai, for example, is for Hong Kong to maintain stability and focus on economic development. Forget about all this infight and destroying the one country, two system, for example, and forgetting about America or Britain coming to Hong Kong's rescue to make Hong Kong freer, for example, as a SAR or as a country or as a region. Some people want to turn Hong Kong into a country. How could that be possible? That's really indulging in fantasy. Hong Kong will always be part of China. You need to live with the reality of Hong Kong as it is. So I have big hope and very optimistic about Shenzhen, but I hope people in Hong Kong will really get their acts together, clean the house, and restore law and order, and resume the path of economic development. That's the key for Hong Kong.
Hong Kong being part of China is the bottom line here. And Mr. Xu, briefly, if you may, how do Hong Kong and Shenzhen function differently and together in the ambitious blueprint of the Greater Bay Area encompassing the Guangdong Province, Hong Kong, and Macau?
That's a good point. The Great Bay Area, I would say that's the future for Hong Kong and for Hong Kong's young people. There's a brighter prospect for young people in terms of jobs, in terms of opportunities, in terms of solving this housing problem in Hong Kong. I think people should look at the further integration with the regional cities, including Shenzhen, Guangzhou, and other cities last year in this region. I would say Hong Kong still can play a very important role as a financial hub to help finance further projects in this region.
Gentlemen, great insight today. I want to thank for all of your input. Lawrence Ma of the Hong Kong Legal Exchange Foundation, Victor Gao from the Center for China and Globalization, and Qinduo from the Pangoal Institution. And that is all from this edition of The Point. As always, follow us on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with LX. I'm Zhong Shi, in for Liu Xin today. Thank you for your company.